The chill of that March night crept through the window cracks, making me shiver as I watched Dr. Ramsey leave my son's room. His words echoed in my head like an endless refrain. "Mrs. Caroline, Billy urgently needs this treatment. Without it, I can't guarantee his recovery." It felt as though the ground were opening up beneath my feet. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears, as if it were trying to escape from my chest. With trembling steps, I entered the small room. There he lay, my Billy, my reason for living. So fragile in that bed, as if it were swallowing him whole. His eyes were closed and his little chest rose and fell with difficulty, breaking my heart. He was barely 6 years old and had already endured so much. I moved closer and gently stroked his forehead, brushing aside a rebellious lock of hair. He was burning with fever. "Mom, I'm here, my love," I whispered, even though I knew he couldn't hear me. "Everything's going to be all right." But how could I promise that when I didn't even believe it myself? I left his room with a heavy heart and made my way to the kitchen. I needed a coffee, something to keep me upright and help me think clearly. As the coffee maker gurgled, my mind raced, searching for a solution. The treatment was expensive, far beyond our current means. But I couldn't let my son's life depend on a sum of money. He was more precious than any bank account, any business, any material thing in this world. With the cup of coffee in hand, I sat on the worn-out sofa in our tiny living room. The walls, once adorned with family photos, now looked bare. Arthur had taken them down months ago, claiming they reminded him of better times. I glanced at the clock, 11:30 at night. I knew Arthur wouldn't be long in arriving, and with him, the inevitable confrontation. As if my thoughts had summoned him, I heard the sound of his pickup truck parking in front of the house. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. The door swung open and Arthur entered, his suit impeccably pressed and that air of superiority that, of late, never seemed to leave him. Still awake, he asked more as an accusation than a genuine question. "Arthur, we need to talk," I said, trying to keep my composure. "It's about Billy." I saw his expression harden. "What's wrong now with the kid?" I explained the situation, the urgency of the treatment, Dr. Ramsey's recommendation. As I spoke, Arthur loosened his tie and poured himself a whiskey. He didn't even look at me when I finished. "We don't have the resources for that right now, Caroline," he said with a coldness that sent shivers down my spine. "I've already told you my money is tied up in other matters." "Other matters?" I repeated in disbelief. "What could be more important than your son's health?" "My business, for one," he replied, taking a sip of his drink. "Without it, we'd have nothing. You should be grateful for the roof over your head." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't the man I'd married 10 years ago. The Arthur I once knew would have moved heaven and earth for his family. This was a stranger wearing my husband's face. "But Arthur, he's Billy. Our son. How can you?" "Enough," he shouted, slamming his glass on the table. I said no, and that's final. Now I'm going to bed. I have an important meeting tomorrow. I watched him climb the stairs without even glancing toward Billy's room. I stood there in the middle of the living room, tears beginning to stream down my cheeks. When had we come to this? When had Arthur ceased to be the loving man I once knew? That night, sleep eluded me. I stayed by Billy's bedside, watching over his restless sleep, dabbing the cool sweat from his brow, and silently praying for a miracle. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the window, I made a decision that would change everything. Early in the morning, after ensuring that Arthur had left for work, I called my neighbor, Mrs. Lucy. She was an older woman who had always been kind to us and adored Billy. "Mrs. Lucy? It's Caroline. Could I ask you a huge favor?" "Of course, honey. What do you need?" "Could you watch Billy for a few hours? I have to step out for something important." "Absolutely. You know that sweet angel is like a grandson to me. I'll be right over." After explaining Billy's situation and giving Mrs. Lucy instructions on his medication, I left the house with determination. My destination, the bank. The National Bank was downtown, about a 20-minute bus ride away. Throughout the journey, my heart raced uncontrollably. I knew what I was about to do would have consequences, but I saw no other way out. I entered the bank and approached one of the teller windows. A young woman with a warm smile greeted me. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "Good morning," I replied, striving to keep my composure. "I need to make a withdrawal from the joint account I share with my husband." As the teller verified my details, I couldn't help but nervously glance around. It felt as if everyone in the bank could read my intentions, as if they knew I was about to do something Arthur would consider a betrayal. "How much would you like to withdraw, ma'am?" the teller asked. I provided the exact amount needed for Billy's treatment. I saw her eyes widen ever so slightly at the sum, but she said nothing. "One moment, please," she said, and walked away to speak with her supervisor. Those minutes of waiting felt eternal. I imagined Arthur barging into the bank, catching me red-handed. But nothing of the sort happened. The teller returned with a professional smile. "Here you go, ma'am. Anything else you need?" I left the bank with the money safely in my purse, a mix of relief and fear washing over me. I knew confronting Arthur would be brutal, but I couldn't let my little Billy suffer because of his father's neglect. Back home, I paid Mrs. Lucy for her help and immediately called Dr. Ramsey. "Doctor, I have the money for the treatment. Can we start today?" The doctor's voice sounded relieved on the other end of the line. "Of course, Caroline. Bring Billy to the hospital as soon as possible." While I prepared Billy for his trip to the hospital, I couldn't help but think about what would follow. That act, which to me was an expression of unconditional love, would become the catalyst for my worst nightmare. But at that moment, as I saw the light in my son's eyes when I told him he'd soon feel better, I knew I'd do it all over again if I had to. Because that's what mothers do. We fight. We protect. We love. No matter the cost. The sun was beginning to set behind the buildings of our little town of Riverdale when we returned from the hospital. Billy slept peacefully in my arms, exhausted from his first day of treatment, yet showing a flush on his cheeks I hadn't seen in weeks. I carefully laid him in his bed, tucking him in with his favorite blanket, the one adorned with dinosaur prints that his grandmother had given him before she passed. As I watched him sleep, I heard the unmistakable roar of Arthur's truck approaching. My heart began pounding furiously, as if trying to break free from my chest. I knew the moment I dreaded had arrived. The front door burst open with a thud that made the walls of our modest home tremble. Arthur's heavy footsteps echoed down the hall, coming at me like an unstoppable storm. "Caroline!" His voice boomed through the house. "Where are you?" I took a deep breath, summoning all the strength I could. I left Billy's room, closing the door gently so as not to wake him. I made my way to the living room, where Arthur awaited me with an almost palpable fury. There he stood, his suit rumpled and his tie slack, holding a sheet of paper in his hand. His bloodshot eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made me tremble. "What did you do, Caroline?" he demanded, though it was clear he already knew the answer. His voice was low and dangerous, like the growl of an injured animal. "I spent the money on Billy's treatment," I confessed, struggling to keep my voice steady. It sounded firmer than I felt inside. For a long moment, silence filled the room. I could hear the ticking of the old wall clock, my parents' wedding gift, marking seconds that stretched into eternity. Suddenly, Arthur exploded. "You and that kid are nothing but dead weight." His words hit me like a series of slaps. "How do you make decisions without consulting me? It's my money, damn it." He stepped toward me, and instinctively, I recoiled. "Arthur, please," I tried to reason. Billy needed it. "He's our son, he sneered, his face contorted in rage. "All that brat has done is drain our resources since he was born. And for what? So he can always be sick." Every word was like a dagger to my heart. How could he speak so callously about his own child? Where was the man who had cried tears of joy when Billy was born? "Don't speak about him like that," I said, feeling anger rising within me. "Billy is a wonderful child. If you just take the time to know him, don't tell me what to do." Arthur roared, slamming his fist onto the table so hard that the vase of flowers he'd bought that morning to brighten the house wobbled and crashed to the floor, shattering into 1,000 pieces. Water and petals spilled across the wooden floor, a metaphor for how our family was falling apart. I instinctively bent down to pick up the fragments, more out of habit than genuine concern for the vase. Arthur grabbed my arm, forcing me to stand. "Look at me when I speak," he growled, his breath reeking of alcohol. It wasn't the first time he'd come home drunk, but I'd never seen him so out of control. "Arthur, you're hurting me," I said, trying to free myself from his grip. "Hurting you?" He laughed, but there was no humor in his laugh. "You're the one hurting me. Do you have any idea what you've done? That money was earmarked for a crucial investment in my business. You could have ruined everything. Is your business more important than your son's life?" I demanded, unable to contain my indignation. "Without my business, we'd have nothing," he screamed, releasing me with such force that I staggered backward. "Do you think it's easy to keep this house? To pay the bills? To fund your whims and that kid's demands?" "Whims?" I repeated in disbelief. "You call wanting our son to live a proper life a whim?" Arthur ran a hand through his hair in frustration. For a moment, I caught a glimpse of the man I once loved, lost and frightened. But as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, replaced by a mask of rage and resentment. "I'm done," he finally declared, his voice dangerously calm. "I'm done with you, done with that kid, done with this life that isn't what I wanted." His words left me breathless. How had we come to this point? I recalled our early years together, filled with dreams and promises. Where had it all gone? "If you're so fed up with us, then why are you still here?" I asked, surprised by my own audacity. Arthur looked at me, his eyes flashing with a mix of shock and fury. "You're right," he said slowly. "Why am I still here?" He moved toward the front door, grabbing the keys to his truck from the bowl by the door. "Where are you going?" I asked, feeling a mix of relief and terror at the thought of him leaving. "That's none of your business," he replied curtly. "But when I get back, I want you and that kid gone. Understand? Out of my house." "What?" "Arthur, you can't do this." "Where are we supposed to go?" "It's not my problem," he said, opening the door. "You should have thought of that before you stole from me." "I didn't steal from you," I screamed, tears welling up in my eyes. "It's our money, our joint account." But Arthur wouldn't listen. He stormed out, slamming the door so hard that the pictures on the wall trembled. I heard the roar of his truck's engine, then the sound of tires screeching on the asphalt as he drove away. I stood there in the middle of the living room, surrounded by the shattered remains of the vase, feeling as though my life had been shattered in the same way. Tears streamed freely down my cheeks as I allowed myself to cry for the first time in what felt like years. A soft sound pulled me out of my stupor. Billy stood in the doorway of the living room, his small figure illuminated by the hallway light. "Mom?" His voice trembled with fear. Why was Daddy yelling? I quickly wiped away my tears and knelt down to his level. "It's nothing, my love," I said, trying to sound calm. "Daddy was just a little angry, but he'll calm down." Billy looked at me with his big brown eyes, so much like my own. "Are we going to have to leave?" My heart broke a little more at the realization that he had heard more than I'd intended. For a moment, I considered lying to him, telling him everything would be fine and we wouldn't have to go anywhere. But as I looked into his eyes, I remembered all the times Arthur had disappointed us, all the broken promises, all the moments of tension and fear. And I made a decision. "Yes, my love," I said softly, caressing his cheek. "We're going to leave for a while. It'll be like an adventure, don't you think?" Billy nodded, though I could see worry in his eyes. "Can we take Mr. Dino with us?" he asked, referring to his favorite stuffed animal. Of course, I smiled, a surge of love for this little soul who trusted me so completely. "Go get him while I pack a few things, all right?" As Billy ran off to his room, I stood and looked around. This house, which had once been our home, now felt cold and hostile. I knew we had to leave, but where? I had no family nearby, and most of my friends had drifted away over time because of Arthur's constant criticisms. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. Instead, I felt a determination I hadn't known I possessed. I grabbed a suitcase from the closet and began filling it with essentials, clothes for Billy and me, his medications, a few toys, and Billy's favorite blanket. As I packed, my eyes fell on a framed photo on the dresser. It was Arthur, Billy, and me, smiling in the park on a sunny Sunday from years ago. How had we gone from that happy family to this? With a sigh, I turned the photo face down. That chapter of our lives was over. Now, it was time to write a new one, just Billy and me. "I'm ready, Mom," Billy said, appearing in the doorway with Mr. Dino clutched tightly to his chest. "Me too, my love," I replied, closing the suitcase. "Let's go." Hand in hand, Billy and I left that house, which had also been my prison, and stepped into the night, into the unknown. The tears would come later, but in that moment, all that mattered was keeping my son safe. As we walked along the sidewalk beneath the soft glow of streetlights, I felt the weight of uncertainty on my shoulders. Yet, I also felt something else, hope. Because despite everything, we had something Arthur would never understand. We had each other. And that, as I squeezed Billy's hand, was worth more than any bank account or successful business. The streets of our small town of Riverdale seemed endless as we walked under the dim glow of the streetlights. The cool night air wrapped around us, carrying with it the scent of spring blossoms from the gardens of the old colonial homes. My brave little Billy walked beside me, his tiny hand gripping mine as if it were a lifeline in the midst of the storm that our lives had become. "Mom, where are we going?" Billy asked, his voice tired yet curious. "We're going to find a place to rest, my love," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The truth was, I had no idea where to go. My family lived in Miami, hours away, and most of my friends had drifted apart over time due to Arthur's constant criticisms. We walked along Monterey Boulevard, the town's main avenue, usually full of life and color, but at this hour it resembled a ghostly scene. The grand historic mansions, silent witnesses to our flight, loomed imposingly around us. Under other circumstances, I would have admired their beauty, but now all I could think about was finding a refuge for my son. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted a small hotel near Central Plaza. A worn but welcoming sign read "Pilgrim's Inn." With few options available, I decided it would be our shelter for the night. The receptionist, an older woman with a kind face, looked at us with curiosity as we entered. We certainly didn't present a common sight, a tearful woman and a small child at such a late hour. "Good evening," I greeted, striving to keep my composure. "Do you have a room available?" The woman, whose name tag identified her as Mrs. Carmen, nodded slowly. "Yes, we do. How long will you be needing it?" I hesitated. I had no idea how long we could stay. The money I'd withdrawn from our account was for Billy's treatment, not for this. "For tonight only," I finally replied. As Mrs. Carmen processed our reservation, Billy tugged gently at my blouse. "Mom, I'm hungry," he whispered. My heart sank. In our haste to leave, I'd forgotten to pack any food. "We'll eat something soon, my love," I promised, though I wasn't sure how I would keep that promise. As if she'd read my thoughts, Mrs. Carmen intervened. "There's a small kitchenette in the room," she said kindly. "And I believe we have some provisions I can give you for tonight." Tears threatened to well in my eyes at this unexpected act of kindness. "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice breaking with emotion. Once in our room, a small but clean space with 2 twin beds, Billy collapsed onto one of them, clutching Mr. Dino. I helped him change and eat some of the food Mrs. Carmen had provided, sweet bread, fruit, and a little milk. While Billy slept, I sat on the other bed, the reality of our situation weighing on me like a crushing burden. What was I going to do? How was I going to support my son, continue his treatment, and find a place to live? It felt as if I were caught in the middle of a storm, unable to see the path ahead. The following days turned into a routine of survival. Each morning, I woke with the hope that it had all been a nightmare, only to face the harsh reality again. I paid for the hotel each night with the little cash I had left, but I sensed the day was coming when even this makeshift refuge would vanish. My brave little warrior, Billy, never complained. He spent his days drawing with the pencils and paper Mrs. Carmen had given him, creating colorful worlds where we were happy and safe. His strength gave me the courage to press on. One afternoon, while Billy napped, I decided to go out in search of work. I roamed the streets of the historic downtown, visiting shops, restaurants, and offices, offering to do any kind of work. But everywhere the answer was the same: "I'm sorry, we're not hiring at the moment." I returned to the hotel defeated, only to find Billy awake and frightened. "Mom, I thought you left like Daddy did," he shouted, throwing himself into my arms, tears streaming down his face. I hugged him tightly, feeling my heart break even more. "I'll never leave you, my love, I promised," kissing his forehead. "You and I are in this together, remember?" That night, as Billy slept, I sat by the window, watching the city lights. I felt more alone than ever, as if the whole world had forgotten us. Then my phone, silent for days, vibrated with a message. It was from Peter, an old college friend who now worked as an attorney in town. "Caroline, I've heard rumors about your situation. Are you okay? Do you need help?" The tears I'd been holding back finally overflowed. Someone remembered us. Someone cared. With trembling fingers, I replied briefly, explaining our situation. His response came almost immediately. "Meet me tomorrow at 10 a.m. at the cafe in St. Lucie Park. We're going to fix this together." That night, for the first time in days, I slept with a spark of hope in my heart. The next morning, after making sure Billy would be well cared for by Mrs. Carmen for a few hours, I headed to St. Lucie Park. The park, with its lush trees and central kiosk, was an oasis of tranquility amid the bustling town. Peter was already there when I arrived, seated at one of the cafe tables. When he saw me, he immediately stood up, his face a mixture of concern and relief. "Caroline," he said, embracing me tightly. "How are you? And how's Billy?" We sat down, and between sips of coffee, I told him everything: Billy's treatment, Arthur's reaction, our hasty departure. Peter listened intently, his brow furrowing more with each detail. "What Arthur did is an abuse," he finally said, his voice laced with indignation. "You have rights, Caroline. You and Billy have rights. We're going to fight for you." "But, Peter," I protested weakly, "I don't have money for a lawyer. I can barely afford the hotel day by day." Peter took my hand across the table, his gaze determined. "I'll be your attorney," he declared. "At no cost. Consider it a favor for all the times you helped me study for exams back in college." His offer left me speechless. It was the first real ray of light I'd seen in days. And Peter continued, "I know someone who can help you with a temporary job while we sort this out. It's at the municipal library. It's not much, but it'll help you stay afloat." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt I could breathe. The storm around us was still raging, but now I had an umbrella, a refuge. "Thank you, Peter," I managed between tears. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You don't have to," he replied with a warm smile. "That's what friends are for. Now, let's work on your case." Arthur has no idea who he's dealing with. That afternoon, I returned to the hotel with a plan and renewed hope. Billy greeted me with a hug and a new drawing, just the two of us smiling under a bright sun. "Look, Mom," he said, pointing to the picture. "It's us and we're happy." I looked at the drawing, then at my son, and felt a renewed determination growing inside me. "Yes," I thought, "we're going to be happy. This storm will pass, and when it does, we'll be stronger than ever." "It's beautiful, my love," I told him, holding him tight. And you know what? I believe that very soon, that drawing will come true. As I held Billy close, I thought of everything we had been through and what still lay ahead: the legal battle with Arthur, the search for a permanent home, continuing Billy's treatment. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel overwhelmed. I had my son, I had a friend who believed in us, and I had the strength only a mother can find when fighting for her child. The storm still raged around us, but we were no longer alone in it. And with that certainty, I prepared to face whatever came next, knowing that, no matter what, Billy and I would face it together. Weeks turned into months. With Peter's help, little by little, we rebuilt our lives. The job at the municipal library, though modest, allowed us to get by, and Billy continued his treatment thanks to an assistance program Peter had managed to secure. But we both knew that the real battle was yet to come. The day of the trial loomed inexorably, along with the confrontation I had dreaded since the night we fled. The morning of the trial dawned under a leaden sky over Riverdale, as if nature itself sensed the tension ahead. I woke before dawn, unable to sleep. Billy slept soundly in the next room, oblivious to the whirlwind of emotions consuming me. Careful not to wake him, I got up and prepared. I chose a simple yet formal dress I'd bought at a second-hand store for the occasion. As I looked at myself in the mirror, trying to tame my unruly hair, I couldn't help but reflect on how much my life had changed in recent months. The woman staring back was stronger, more determined, but also carried the marks of exhaustion and worry. Mrs. Carmen, who had become our guardian angel at the hotel, offered to watch Billy during the trial. "Don't worry, dear," she said as we said our goodbyes. "We'll be here praying for you." The Riverdale courthouse loomed before me, its limestone columns seeming to regard me with disdain. I took a deep breath and clutched the medallion my mother had given me years ago, searching it for the strength I needed. Peter was waiting for me on the steps, his impeccable suit contrasting with my modest attire. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice a blend of concern and determination. I nodded, unable to speak. Together, we climbed the steps and entered the building. Inside, the courthouse was a hive of activity. Lawyers with expensive leather briefcases, police officers, and citizens of every kind moved about. Yet for me, everything seemed to be in slow motion. Every step I took echoed in my ears, reminding me of what was at stake. When we entered the courtroom, I saw him. Arthur was there, as elegant as ever in a suit that probably cost more than everything Billy and I now had. Our eyes met for an instant, and a chill ran down my spine. His expression was a mix of arrogance and disdain that made me tremble. As I passed by him to take our seats, I heard him mutter, "I hope you enjoyed playing the martyr, because today your little show is over." His words, though barely audible, hit me like a punch. Noticing my distress, Peter squeezed my arm in silent support. "Don't let him intimidate you," he whispered. "We're on the right side." The judge, an elderly man with a stern expression, entered the room. We all rose, and with a bang of his gavel, the proceedings began. The next few hours were a whirlwind of testimonies, legal arguments, and cross-accusations. Arthur's lawyer, a man with a booming voice and theatrical gestures, tried to paint me as an irresponsible, spendthrift woman. Each of his words was like a stab, distorting every action I had taken for my son's well-being. "Your Honor," the lawyer thundered, "this woman not only stole money from the joint account, but she has been manipulating the situation for her own benefit. Isn't it suspicious that just as my client was about to close a crucial deal, she decided to abscond with a child?" I felt my blood boil. How dare he insinuate that I had planned all this? That leaving my home, living in a hotel, and struggling day by day were part of some diabolical scheme? Peter, for his part, was methodical and precise. He presented evidence after evidence of the years of suffering, emotional manipulation, and neglect that Billy and I had endured. Testimonies from neighbors, medical records, even text messages showing Arthur's indifference to his son's health. "Your Honor," Peter said in a clear, firm voice, "what we see here isn't the case of an irresponsible woman. It's the case of a mother desperate to save her child's life. A mother who, faced with her husband's negligence and abuse, took the only action she could to protect her little one." I saw some of the jurors nod, their expressions softening. For a moment, I felt a spark of hope. But Arthur, irritated by the fact that his control was beginning to crumble, did something unexpected. At a moment when the judge was reviewing some documents, he stood up and approached me. Before anyone could react, he raised his hand and, to the astonishment of everyone in the room, slapped me. The sound of that slap resounded like a gunshot. For a moment, everything went silent. I felt the sting on my cheek, but more than the physical pain, it was the humiliation that struck me. Right there, in front of everyone, Arthur had shown his true face. The judge banged his gavel forcefully, calling the courtroom to order. "Mr. Arthur Vega, what do you think you're doing? This is a court of law, not a boxing ring." Court officers hurried to restrain Arthur, who seemed to have completely lost control. "She deserved it," he shouted as they pulled him away. "She's a thief, a liar." Peter sprang to his feet, his voice trembling with indignation. "Your Honor, I demand immediate action against Mr. Vega. This act of violence is irrefutable proof of what my client has been enduring." The judge, visibly disturbed, nodded. Mr. Vega, you're in contempt of court. Officers, escort him out of the courtroom. We will continue these proceedings without him. As they led Arthur out, his shouts and insults echoing down the corridors, I felt a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, the humiliation and pain of being publicly assaulted. On the other, a sense of liberation. At last, everyone had seen the real Arthur, the monster hidden behind that elegant suit and charming smile. After order was restored, the judge turned to me with a look of both compassion and respect. Mrs. Caroline, I deeply regret what just happened. Are you all right? Do you need medical attention? I shook my head, finding my voice. I'm fine, Your Honor. It's nothing new to me. My words seemed to have a profound impact on the room. I saw several jurors exchanging looks of concern and sympathy. The judge nodded gravely. I understand. Given the circumstances, we will take a 30-minute recess. When we return, we'll hear the final arguments. During the break, Peter and I retreated to a small conference room. My lawyer and friend seemed to be buzzing with contained energy. Caroline, he said, taking my hands in his, I know this has been horrible for you, but from a legal standpoint, what just happened is the best thing that could have happened for our case. Arthur has just shown, in front of everyone, exactly what he's capable of. I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion. I know, Peter. It's just. I never imagined we'd come to this point. How could I have been married to a man like him? Peter looked at me with compassion. Don't blame yourself. Abusers are experts at hiding their true nature. The important thing is that you're now free of him. When we returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had noticeably shifted. The sympathetic, supportive looks from those present gave me the strength to stand tall. The closing arguments were brief. Arthur's lawyer, clearly thrown off by the events, tried to downplay what had occurred, arguing that his client had acted under extreme stress. Peter, on the other hand, was uncompromising. Your Honor, members of the jury, he began, his voice resonating in the courtroom, today we have witnessed the true nature of Mr. Arthur Vega. A man who not only neglected his own son's health, but has also physically and emotionally abused his wife for years. Mrs. Caroline is neither a thief nor an opportunist. She is a brave mother who did what any loving parent would do, protect her child at all costs. I ask you to consider not only the facts presented, but also the actions we have witnessed here today. Justice must prevail. When the jury retired to deliberate, I felt as if the weight of the world rested on my shoulders. Everything Billy and I had endured, everything we'd fought for, culminated in this moment. The hours of waiting were excruciating. Every minute felt like torture. But finally, the jury returned. The verdict was unanimous. In a solemn voice, the judge announced, "This court rules in favor of Mrs. Caroline Mitchell. Custody of your son, Billy Vega Mitchell, is hereby granted solely to you. Furthermore, Mr. Arthur Vega shall pay substantial child support and cover all of the minor's medical expenses. Additionally, regarding the incident that occurred in this courtroom today, an order of protection is issued against Mr. Vega." The judge's words rang in my ears like music. I felt an enormous weight lift from my shoulders. I had won. We had won. Amid the murmurs and commotion in the courtroom, I turned to Peter, tears streaming down my cheeks. "Thank you," I whispered, embracing him tightly. "Thank you for believing in us." As we left the courthouse, the sky over Riverdale had cleared. The sun shone brightly, as if celebrating our victory. I thought of Billy, of the life we could now build together, free from fear and oppression. The legal battle was over, but I knew that the road to true healing was just beginning. Yet, for the first time in a long while, I felt that the future was bright. Billy and I were safe, and together, we could overcome any obstacle life threw our way. I left the Riverdale courthouse with a jumble of emotions that I could barely process. The relief and joy of winning the trial intermingled with the emotional exhaustion of the past months and the tension of the last few hours. The afternoon sun bathed Central Plaza, and for a moment, I paused on the courthouse steps, allowing myself to take a deep breath for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Peter was by my side, his hand resting on my shoulder in a silent gesture of support. "You did it, Caroline," he said with a warm smile. "You should be proud of yourself." I nodded, unable to find the words to express my gratitude. "Thank you, Peter. None of this would have been possible without you." We began to walk through the plaza, the bustle of the city around us contrasting with the calm I was starting to feel inside. Street vendors shouted their wares, pigeons cooed around the central fountain, and tourists strolled by, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded in court. Life went on, and at last, I felt that Billy and I could be a part of it again. "You know, there's something I didn't mention during the trial," I said, breaking the silence as we sat on a bench under the shade of a stately southern magnolia. "Something that might change things even more." Peter looked at me with curiosity. "What's that?" I reached into my purse and pulled out a yellowed envelope, slightly crumpled with age. "It's our marriage contract," I explained. I'd kept it all these years, almost forgotten in the back of a drawer. Peter's eyes widened in surprise. "A marriage contract? Caroline, why didn't you mention this before?" I sighed, feeling the weight of years and past decisions. I suppose a part of me wanted to win this case on its own merits, without relying on legal technicalities. I wanted the judge and the jury to see the truth of our situation, not just a piece of paper. Peter nodded, understanding. "It's admirable, but this document could have been crucial. May I see it?" I handed him the envelope and watched as his eyes quickly scanned its contents. His expression shifted from curiosity to astonishment within seconds. "Caroline, this is incredible," he finally said, looking up from the document. "Were you aware of what this contract contains?" I shook my head. Honestly, I hadn't read it in years. Arthur drafted it at the beginning of our marriage, when he was still the sweet, considerate man I fell in love with. He asked me to sign it as a token of mutual trust. At the time, I thought it was a romantic gesture. Peter let out an incredulous laugh. "Well, that romantic gesture has just become your ticket to a better life. There's a clause here that stipulates that in the event of abandonment or abuse, the affected party would receive a significant portion of the other's assets, along with what's necessary for the support of any shared child." My heart skipped a beat. "What? Are you sure?" "Absolutely," Peter confirmed, pointing to a specific paragraph in the document. "Look, it's stated clearly here." Arthur must have completely forgotten about this clause, or never imagined we'd come to this. I fell silent for a moment, processing this new information. It was ironic that the document Arthur had drafted as a sign of his love was now becoming the instrument of his downfall. "What does this mean for us now?" I asked at last. Peter leaned forward, his voice filled with restrained excitement. "It means, my dear, that not only have you won custody of Billy and secured child support, but with this contract we can secure your future, and his, in ways we never even imagined a few hours ago." The reality of our situation began to settle in. Suddenly, the future I'd timidly envisioned, a future where Billy and I could live without constant worry, seemed not only possible but imminent. "I need to make a few calls and review some legal details," Peter continued, standing up with renewed energy. "But Caroline, get ready. Things are about to change drastically for you and Billy." As Peter walked away to make his calls, I remained seated on the bench, watching the life that flowed around me in the plaza, couples strolling hand in hand, children playing, elders basking in the afternoon sun. These were the everyday scenes that had once felt so distant and unattainable. "Do you think we'll ever see him again?" I took a deep breath before answering. "I don't know, my love. But what I do know is that you and I are together, and we love each other very much. And that's what matters most." Billy smiled and hugged me. That night, as Billy slept, I sat on the small porch of our new home, gazing at the stars. I thought of everything we had been through, how close we had come to losing everything. And I promised myself that I would never again let fear or doubt cloud my judgment when it came to my son's well-being. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Gradually, we established a new routine. I enrolled Billy in a nearby school, where he soon made friends and began to flourish academically. Seeing him come home each day with a smile on his face, eager to tell me about his classes and his new friends, brought me a joy I never tired of. I also began to rebuild my professional life. With part of the money I received from the trial, I decided to resume my college studies I had abandoned years ago when I married Arthur. I enrolled at Riverdale State University to finish my degree in psychology. Balancing school with raising Billy wasn't easy, but every challenge overcome felt like a personal victory. One afternoon, while studying in the university library, a classmate approached me. "Caroline, right?" she said with a warm smile. "I'm Lucy. I was wondering if you'd like to join our study group. We meet on Saturday mornings at the downtown cafe." For a moment, I felt the urge to decline. Years of isolation imposed by Arthur had left their mark, making me wary of new friendships. But then I thought of Billy, of how he was slowly opening up to the world, making new friends. Shouldn't I do the same? "I'd love to," I replied, surprised by my own enthusiasm. That study group became much more than an academic tool. Slowly, I forged genuine friendships, relationships based on mutual respect and support. It was as if, by opening myself to these new connections, I was healing parts of me I didn't even know were wounded. Billy's treatment was also progressing well. Each visit to the doctor brought good news, and watching my son regain his strength and vitality was nothing short of a daily miracle. His cheeks, once pale, now bloomed with color, and his laughter, the sound I had missed so dearly, filled our home with contagious joy. One evening, while we were preparing dinner together, a new tradition we'd started, Billy surprised me with a question. "Mom, are you happy now?" I paused mid-slice of a carrot, taken aback by the depth of his question. I looked at my son, his big brown eyes filled with curiosity and love. "Yes, my love," I replied honestly. "I'm very happy. And you?" Billy smiled, that radiant smile lighting up the room. "I'm happy too, Mom. I like our life now." At that moment, I felt my heart swell with love and gratitude. We had been through so much, fought so hard, and now, finally, we were reaping the rewards of our resilience. The months passed, and with them, our wounds slowly healed. I learned to forgive myself for the years I'd allowed Arthur to dictate every aspect of my life, and more importantly, I learned that my worth wasn't defined by his words or actions. I discovered a strength within me that I never knew existed, a determination that surprised me every day. Billy, too, was growing, not only physically but emotionally. One day, while we were walking through the park near our home, he suddenly stopped and looked at me seriously. "Mom, do you think I'll ever be able to forgive Daddy?" His question took me by surprise, but I realized it was something he'd been contemplating for a long time. "Forgiveness is a journey, my love," I replied carefully. "It's not something that happens overnight, and you're not obliged to forgive if you're not ready. The important thing is not to let anger consume you. Your daddy made mistakes, big mistakes, but they don't define who you are." Billy nodded, absorbing my words. "I think I understand. I'm not ready to forgive him now, but maybe one day I will. And that's okay, right?" "Exactly," I smiled, marveling at his maturity. "I'm very proud of you, you know?" He smiled and took my hand as we continued our walk. In that moment, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. Our life together was still filled with challenges, but every obstacle was a testament to our resilience. Arthur was now a closed chapter, a painful but necessary lesson. There were days when the memory still stung, moments when I wondered how things might have been different. But those moments grew rarer, replaced by the joy of the present and hope for the future. One afternoon, as I was helping Billy with his science homework, I received a call from Peter. My friend and attorney had remained a constant presence in our lives, always ready to offer support and advice. "Caroline," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I have news. Arthur has agreed to relinquish all his parental rights. Billy is officially and legally yours alone." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. It was the definitive end of a chapter in our lives, a confirmation that we were truly free to move forward without looking back. That night, as Billy slept, I stepped out onto the porch of our new home and gazed at the stars, just as I had so many times before. But this time, there was no fear or uncertainty in my heart, only gratitude and hope. I thought of everything we had been through, of how we had risen from the ashes of our old life. Billy, with his curious gaze and unconditional love, had become my beacon in the darkness. Together, we had learned that true love does not hurt, that family is built with patience and dedication. Life had tested us, pushed us to the brink, but together we had managed to build a future where we could finally breathe easy. And as the night sky over Riverdale shone above me, I felt a deep certainty. The best was yet to come. Our rebirth from the ashes hadn't been easy, but it had been beautiful. And now, with each new day, with each of Billy's smiles, with every small victory, we celebrated our resilience, our love, and the promise of a bright future ahead. The journey had been long and arduous, but finally, we were home. And this time, I knew it was forever.